Margaret Wren ruled St. Hallow's home for children with the calm precision of a woman who believed she was doing God's work, and for decades, the people of Alder's Hallow believed her too. But when Thomas Reed, a retired gardener, struck something solid beneath the soil one misty morning, the quiet village discovered that their beloved orphanage hadn't been a place of care at all. It had been a graveyard, and the secrets buried there would expose one of the darkest chapters in British history. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. Alder's Hallow was the kind of English village people imagined when they thought of peace. It sat quietly between rolling green hills, surrounded by thick woods and winding country lanes, where ivy crept up old stone walls. The houses were small and neat, with smoke curling from their chimneys and gardens full of roses, foxgloves, and the occasional gnome half hidden among the flowers. Life here was slow, predictable, and safe. Neighbors greeted each other by name, children rode bicycles down the narrow lanes, and the loudest sound most days came from the church bell on Sunday mornings. For decades nothing much had changed. It was a place where bad news rarely arrived and crime seemed like something that only happened elsewhere. In the cities, on television, or in stories whispered by outsiders. People in Alder's Hallow liked to think of their home as untouched by time. The little bakery still sold loaves, wrapped in brown paper, the butcher still closed at lunchtime, and the postman still stopped for tea at every third house. There was comfort in routine, in knowing that nothing ever truly disturbed the calm rhythm of village life. Even the police station, the small red brick building on the edge of town, saw little more than missing cats or a broken fence after a storm. Outsiders often described the place as quaint, and the villagers took pride in that. But beneath that sense of security, there was something uneasy, something no one could name. Perhaps it was the way the fog seemed to linger longer over Alder's Hallow than in nearby towns, or how the woods surrounding it grew so thick that sunlight struggled to break through. Some of the older residents spoke quietly about certain areas that were best avoided after dark, but no one ever explained why. The new families who moved in ignored the warnings. They laughed them off as old superstitions and bedtime stories. There was one particular patch of land everyone seemed to forget about. A stretch of overgrown ground near the abandoned village hall. Children playing nearby were told not to go near it because of unstable soil or old construction materials. The real reason was never clear. The land was just there, ignored and left to the wild grass and creeping vines. Over time, people stopped mentioning it altogether. It became invisible, like a piece of history quietly erased. That uneasy stillness began to shift one misty morning in March. The air was damp, the sky dull and low. Thomas Reed, a retired gardener who spent his days tending the public gardens, had been given permission to clear the old land beside the hall. The council wanted to turn it into a community garden, something cheerful, something to bring people together. As he worked, his shovel struck something solid beneath the earth. He expected a rock, maybe an old pipe, but what he uncovered was far stranger. The soil gave way to reveal the corner of a small weathered wooden box. Its edges were smooth with age, the wood dark and splintered. Curious, Thomas brushed away more dirt and pried it open, unaware that in doing so he had just disturbed the first piece of a horrifying secret that Alder's Hallow had kept buried for nearly 60 years. When Thomas Reed opened the small wooden box, a faint, stale smell rose from it. The scent of damp earth and something older, something almost sweet in the wrong way. Inside lay a collection of objects that made no immediate sense. A handful of faded photographs curled at the edges, a few drawings made in crayon on yellowed paper, and a piece of fabric wrapped carefully around something small. The drawings were simple, like those of children. Stick figures standing beside a tall building, smiling faces beneath a large sun. In one corner, a name had been written in wobbly letters, Eddie. Thomas felt a chill. No one in the village had heard that name in decades. With trembling hands he unfolded the fabric, expecting perhaps a toy, a memento left behind. What he found instead made him stagger back in horror. Inside the cloth was a small, perfectly preserved human bone. Thomas froze. For a long moment, he simply stared, the morning fog wrapping around him like a shroud. He didn't shout or call for help immediately. Shock kept him silent. Then instinct took over. He stumbled toward the village hall, phone in hand, and called the local police. Within minutes, the peaceful garden project had become a sealed crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the cold wind as curious villagers began to gather at a distance. Police officers arrived first, followed by a forensics team from the nearby city. The box and its contents were photographed and carefully removed, but investigators quickly realized that this might not be an isolated discovery. When they examined the ground around the spot, they found faint signs of disturbance, the soil uneven in places, small patches that seemed freshly softened despite their age. By afternoon, the decision was made to excavate further. Word spread faster than anyone could have imagined. By evening, every household in Alder's Hollow was talking about it. People gathered outside the cordoned area, whispering about what might be buried there. Some said it was an old cemetery forgotten by time. Others claimed it must have been a plague burial ground. But the older residents, the ones who remembered more than they cared to, stayed silent and refused to meet anyone's eyes. The digging continued into the next day, and soon the truth began to emerge. Beneath layers of compacted soil, the forensic team uncovered more bones. Small ones, fragile, arranged in shallow graves. It was immediately clear that these were not the remains of adults. They belonged to children. The village that had prided itself on safety and simplicity was suddenly at the center of a national investigation. Reporters arrived in vans, their bright cameras flashing under the gray skies. Alder's Hollow, once known for its peaceful charm, was renamed overnight in headlines as Britain's Town of Lost Children. Police tents filled the field. Archaeologists joined the investigation. Each new discovery deepened the mystery. Who were these children? Why were they buried here? And why had no one noticed they were gone? The villagers could no longer pretend that Alder's Hollow was untouched by darkness. Beneath its perfect surface, something monstrous had been sleeping, and now, after decades of silence, it had finally awakened. As the investigation widened, historians and local officials began to trace the land's history, trying to understand what could explain the presence of so many children's remains. Old maps revealed that, before the village hall was built, the site had belonged to an institution called Hallow's Home for Children. Most residents under 50 had never heard the name, and even the oldest among them seemed hesitant to talk about it. The few who remembered described a large stone building that had stood there decades ago, surrounded by iron gates and high hedges. It had been an orphanage, one that operated quietly through the 1950s and 60s before vanishing from records altogether. The official archives offered little information. The council had only a few photographs of the building, and no surviving files on the children who had lived there. The parish church held a ledger that mentioned St. Hallow's donations, but stopped abruptly, and it seemed as if the place had been erased, its name, its residents, and its staff all lost in time. The more investigators searched, the more gaps they found. Some records were missing, others marked as confidential, and others destroyed in what a clerk described as an accidental fire at the county office in the night. Still, rumors began to take shape, whispered by older residents who remembered strange happenings from their youth. They recalled nights when lights burned late in the orphanage's windows, and the faint sounds of crying carried on the wind. Children from the village said they had been forbidden to go near the property, told that the orphans there were sick. Yet, no one could recall ever seeing any of those children outside. Even deliveries of food and medicine had been handled by a single man who came from the city and left quickly after dark. It was as though St. Hallow's existed in its own isolated world, separate from the rest of Alder's Hollow. As police and forensic teams continued to work the site, they uncovered the outlines of old foundations beneath the soil, the remnants of the orphanage's basement and corridors. In one corner, they found fragments of broken glass bottles, rusted instruments, and pieces of children's clothing that had somehow survived the passing decades. The evidence made it impossible to dismiss what had happened there as simple neglect. Something deliberate had taken place, something terrible. Newspapers printed stories daily, some sensationalized, others cautious. Former government workers were interviewed, but few could remember anything about the orphanage. One retired official suggested that St. Hallows had been shut down quietly after reports of unsuitable conditions, but when asked about the missing children he refused to comment further. By the end of that week, the entire country was watching Alder's Hallow, the town's post office, cafe and churchyard filled with reporters and camera crews. The quiet streets that once echoed with birdsong now buzzed with whispers and suspicion. It was clear that St. Hallow's home for children had not simply closed, it had been buried, both literally and in memory. The question that haunted everyone now was why? What had happened within those walls so many years ago that required an entire community to forget? The focus of the investigation soon turned to the woman who had once ruled St. Hallow's home for children with an iron hand. Margaret Wren. Her name appeared again and again in old council records and fragments of church documents. She had been appointed matron of the orphanage in 1959, a woman in her early 40s described as deeply religious, strict and fiercely private. In a few surviving photographs she appeared tall and severe, with neatly pinned hair and a face that betrayed no warmth. Former residents of Alder's Hallow who were children at the time remembered her presence as unsettling, even terrifying. She attended church every Sunday without fail, always dressed in dark clothing, her gloved hands folded tightly in prayer, but no one could recall ever seeing her smile. As the police pieced together her history, a strange pattern emerged. Margaret Wren had previously worked at 2 other children's homes before St. Hallows, both of which had closed after allegations of mistreatment surfaced. Yet, no charges had ever been brought against her. She simply moved from one institution to the next, leaving behind unanswered questions and frightened whispers. By the time she arrived in Alder's Hallow, she had developed a reputation for running her orphanages like prisons. Discipline, silence and obedience were her sacred rule. The children under her care were rarely seen outside the grounds, and visitors were discouraged. Investigators located a few surviving staff members who had worked under her at St. Hallows. Most were elderly, scattered across different parts of the country. One of them, a former cook, spoke hesitantly about the matron's obsession with order. Meals had to be eaten in silence. Children who disobeyed were punished with long hours locked in their rooms or forced to scrub floors until their hands bled. But there were darker things too. Nights when strange visitors arrived by car, when some children were taken from their beds and never returned. The staff were told those children had been adopted, though no adoption papers were ever shown. Margaret Wren's personal life was just as mysterious. She never married, never had children of her own, and seemed to live only for her work. When the orphanage closed in 1967, she disappeared from public record. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. After months of searching, investigators finally discovered that she had lived out her final years under a different name in a small nursing home in Norfolk, dying peacefully in 1998 at the age of 81. A retired nurse from that nursing home later came forward with a haunting detail. In her final months, Margaret Wren had begun talking in her sleep. The nurse remembered her whispering fragments of prayers, asking forgiveness for the buried ones. At the time it seemed like the ramblings of an old woman fading into confusion. But now, knowing what had been found beneath the soil of Alder's Hallow, those words took on a horrifying meaning. The villagers who once remembered her as merely a stern woman now saw her name differently, not as a figure of discipline, but as the face of a nightmare they had chosen to forget. And though she was long dead, her shadow stretched over the investigation, a reminder that evil can hide behind the most respectable appearances, smiling politely at the world while concealing the unthinkable beneath it. The deeper the investigation went, the more frustrating it became for the detectives and journalists who tried to piece together what had really happened at St. Hallows. Every lead seemed to end in confusion or silence. When officers attempted to locate the orphanage's official records, they discovered that nearly everything from 1967, the year the home closed, had vanished. Boxes that should have contained reports, inspection notes, and adoption forms were simply missing. Others were marked as destroyed in a fire that had swept through the county records office decades ago. The official cause of the fire was said to be faulty wiring, but no photographs or documentation existed to confirm the damage. It was as if the paper trail had been deliberately erased. The few surviving papers that did exist raised more questions than they answered. A handful of letters between local officials hinted that concerns had been raised about the conditions at St. Hallows. One note, dated 1966, mentioned repeated absences of certain children from daily attendance lists. Another referred vaguely to improper disciplinary methods. But what caught the investigators' attention most was a letter from a social inspector who had visited the orphanage shortly before it closed. In her report, she described the children as unnaturally quiet, and the matron as uncooperative, secretive, and evasive. The inspector had requested a follow-up visit, but no further documentation could be found. Rumors began to spread that someone powerful had intervened. Some speculated that the orphanage had been funded by private donors who wanted to keep their involvement hidden. Others believed the church or local authorities had buried the scandal to protect their reputations. Elderly villagers whispered that, at the time, everyone knew something was wrong, but had been too afraid to speak. The orphanage provided employment and financial support for the struggling community, and questioning it could have meant losing everything. Fear and dependence had bought their silence. A break in the case came when a dusty storage box was discovered in the basement of the parish church. Inside were receipts, old newsletters, and a few handwritten letters. One letter stood out. It was addressed to a council officer from an anonymous sender who claimed to have worked at the orphanage. The letter mentioned strange medical treatments conducted by a visiting doctor, children being taken for procedures they didn't understand, and the sound of crying echoing through the halls at night. The writer begged the council to intervene but signed the letter only as a friend. No record of a response was ever found. Forensic teams returned to the site to search for traces of chemicals or substances that might support the story of medical experiments, but the soil was too degraded to yield clear evidence. Still, the pattern of missing documents, destroyed archives, and unanswered letters painted a picture of deliberate concealment. By the time the fifth week of excavation began, the truth seemed to be slipping further away. Yet everyone involved felt that they were on the edge of something immense, a secret that had been hidden, not by chance, but by choice. The quiet little village of Alder's Hallow had once been complicit in silence, and now it was paying the price as the ghosts of forgotten children began to reclaim their place in the light. As the search for truth continued, investigators uncovered the name of a man who had been closely associated with St. Hallow's Home for Children. Dr. Leonard Price. His name appeared on old invoices and medical reports that had somehow escaped destruction. He had been the orphanage's appointed physician, responsible for the children's health and well-being. At first glance, he seemed respectable. A well-educated doctor from London who had moved to the countryside in the late 1950s to serve those in need. His reputation had remained untarnished throughout his long career, and after St. Hallow's closed, he continued practicing medicine in various hospitals before retiring comfortably in Devon. But as the police began to examine his past more closely, the respectable image began to crumble. When detectives visited his last known address, a grand old house surrounded by overgrown gardens, they learned that he had died only 2 years earlier. The property had since been left untouched, his belongings sealed away by distant relatives. After obtaining a warrant, police entered the house, and what they found inside changed the course of the investigation entirely. The doctor's study was filled with shelves of leather-bound journals and boxes neatly labeled with dates, stretching back more than half a century. Dust covered everything, but the papers inside were perfectly preserved. Among the documents were medical charts, patient photographs, and notes written in Dr. Price's careful handwriting. Many of the entries referenced St. Hallow's, describing the children not by name but by number. Subject 3, Subject 11, Subject. The notes detailed experiments on nutrition, behavioral conditioning, and immune response. Some records described injections of unknown substances, sensory deprivation, and prolonged fasting, all conducted in the name of child development research. The language was clinical, detached, almost scientific in tone, as if the children had been nothing more than test subjects. Investigators were horrified. The journals included photographs showing small, frightened faces, children strapped to beds or sitting in dark rooms, their eyes blank. Most of the photographs were undated, but the walls and furniture in the background matched descriptions of the orphanage's interior. It became clear that St. Hallow's had not simply been a place of neglect or cruelty, it had been the site of illegal human experimentation. Forensic experts analyzed the journals and confirmed that the writing was genuine. Among the pages were references to approvals from unnamed benefactors who had provided financial support. These benefactors were never identified, but it was evident that the experiments had been funded and protected by someone with influence. The doctor's records also revealed that several of the children had died during or shortly after the procedures, their deaths recorded as complications from illness. The surviving children, it seemed, had been transferred or adopted. Another way of saying they had disappeared. The discovery shocked the nation. News outlets broadcast the details relentlessly, painting Dr. Leonard Price as a monster hiding in plain sight. Yet the more investigators learned, the more questions arose. Who had allowed him to continue practicing medicine for decades afterward? How had he escaped scrutiny for so long? It became painfully clear that St. Hallow's had been more than a home. It was a hidden laboratory, and Alder's Hallow had been its perfect disguise. Interviewing the oldest residents of Alder's Hallow, people who had lived in the village during the 1950s and 60s, many were reluctant to speak, but the weight of the past began to crack their silence. Slowly, they started to share fragments of what they had seen and heard, pieces of a puzzle that revealed the terrible cost of their real lives. Some recalled hearing strange noises at night, not the usual sounds of the countryside, but something else entirely. Muffled cries, sharp metallic clinks, and once, the echo of a scream carried by the wind. Others remembered how, on certain evenings, the orphanage's windows glowed with a faint, flickering light long after midnight. When villagers asked about it, they were told it was simply the doctor working late. Children were warned never to wander near Hallows after dark, and parents repeated the rule without question. In a town where everyone knew everyone, the orphanage had somehow managed to exist as an island of secrets in plain sight. A few residents admitted that they had felt uneasy for years, but had convinced themselves that it was better not to know. The orphanage brought employment to the village. Cooks, cleaners, gardeners and suppliers all relied on it for income. Questioning its operations meant risking one's livelihood and reputation. One elderly man, who had been a delivery driver in his youth, confessed that he had once been told to leave boxes of supplies at the gate and never ask what they were for. When he had tried to look inside one, the matron herself had appeared and warned him that curiosity could bring misfortune. He had never asked again. Then came the testimony that turned the tone of the entire investigation darker still. A woman in her 80s, who had been a child living nearby at the time, claimed that she used to see small processions late at night, figures carrying what looked like stretchers toward the woods behind the orphanage. She remembered the sound of the church bell ringing at strange hours, not for services but for something else. The bell, she said, always rang 3 times, followed by silence. It became a signal of sorts, a sign that another child was gone. When police confronted former local officials, many claimed ignorance, but one retired clerk eventually admitted that the council had received complaints about missing children and harsh punishments. Those reports had been quietly filed away, never acted upon. There was talk of keeping the peace and protecting the village's reputation. In their silence, the townspeople had become part of the machinery that allowed cruelty to thrive. By the time the interviews ended, a grim truth had settled over Alder's Hallow. The tragedy of St. Hallow's was not only the work of a cruel matron or a corrupt doctor. It was the result of a collective decision, a pact of silence, formed out of fear, selfishness, and denial. Every villager who had looked away, Every official who had ignored the signs had played a part in keeping the nightmare alive. The town's beauty and quiet charm had not been a coincidence. It had been built on the buried cries of the innocent. By the time the excavation at Alder's Hollow was complete, the field that had once been planned as a community garden had transformed into one of the most haunting crime scenes in British history. Forensic teams worked in silence under grey skies, carefully uncovering what remained of the children who had once lived and died at St. Hallow's home. When the final count was confirmed, 32 small bodies buried in shallow, unmarked graves, the nation was stunned into disbelief. Each set of remains told a story of suffering. Broken bones that had healed poorly, signs of malnutrition, and evidence of repeated medical intervention. These were not natural deaths. They were casualties of cruelty carried out under the guise of care. The government launched a formal inquiry that reached deep into the archives of social services, the church, and local councils. It became clear that what had happened at St. Hallow's had not been a single institution's failure, but part of a broader system that had allowed vulnerable children to disappear unnoticed. Ministers issued statements of regret, and journalists dug through old files searching for other forgotten homes. Dozens of similar cases surfaced across the country, each one exposing a new layer of hidden neglect and abuse from decades past. St. Hallow's, however, remained the most disturbing of them all. A place where science, faith, and silence had combined to destroy innocence. For the people of Alder's Hollow, life would never be the same. Reporters eventually left, and the television vans stopped crowding the narrow lanes. But the quiet that returned was not the same peaceful stillness it once had been. It was heavier, filled with guilt and remembrance. The villagers could no longer look at their surroundings without thinking of the horror buried beneath their feet. The old church, once a symbol of comfort, now stood as a reminder of complicity. Many residents moved away, unable to live among ghosts. Those who remained dedicated themselves to ensuring that the truth would never again be buried. In time, the council decided to transform the site of the orphanage into a memorial garden. The graves were left undisturbed, marked instead by a circular stone monument inscribed with the words, "For the children who were never allowed to grow." Every year, on the anniversary of the discovery, villagers gather there in silence, placing white flowers along the edge of the memorial. The ceremony is brief, but the air always feels colder, as if the earth itself still remembers. Over the years, stories began to circulate. Quiet tales told by visitors who claimed that, when the wind blew through the trees, they could hear faint laughter or crying from somewhere unseen. Others said they had seen small handprints appear in the frost on the monument's surface, vanishing as the morning light warmed the stone. Whether these tales were superstition or something more, no one could say for certain. But even those who didn't believe in ghosts admitted that Alder's Hollow had changed forever. The village that once prided itself on peace had become a warning, a reminder that evil does not always come from monsters hiding in shadows. Sometimes it lives among ordinary people, buried beneath routine, respectability, and silence. And though the land has grown quiet again, that silence is no longer innocent. It is an echo, the echo of 32 voices that will never be forgotten.